Hello everyone. In this lesson we're going to learn how to manage database tables within the context of Laravel. Before we get into the specifics of how Laravel can manage our database for us, I actually want to begin with what we do not want. So what we do not want is to have to manage the database ourselves and to have to manage the database tables by ourselves. Let me show you an example of what we don't want, just so we have a frame of reference, just so we really appreciate what Laravel does for us and why it's so useful. So this is what we do not want to have to do. So if you open up MySQL Workbench and connect to your database server, right, and then you expand our Laravel app database and you click on tables, and if you right click on tables, you can click create table. And here we can give it a name. You don't need to do this, by the way. You can follow along, but you don't need to. This is just an example. But imagine if I had a database table named pets. And then the first column is an ID. Again, you don't need to follow along, but it's the primary key. It's not null. It'll auto increment. And then imagine we have another column called name. And then imagine we have another column called species. Right? So I'm designing what columns should be in this pets table. Now I can go ahead and click apply in the bottom corner, apply, close. So now if I go into tables, there's this table called pets. If I click this icon, I can view all the items in it. There aren't any items in it, but I can add one. So I'll say, meows a lot, and for the species, it's a cat. And let me add two more. So I could say barks a lot, species dog. I could say purrs loud, species cat. And then click apply. Let me insert these three items into the pets table. So now if you click on this icon to query for all items in that table, awesome. Right? So our table has three columns, ID, name, and species. And then you could query for only the cats, right? So you could say select all from this where species equals cat. If I run that query, now I only see the two items that are a cat. Cool. So obviously this is working, but the downside is that you and I had to create that table manually. That may not seem like a big deal, but what if we want to start fresh and host this application on a different development computer? You would need to manually replay all of these steps, right? And imagine if you had 10 different tables and each table had, 8 or 9 different columns. Also, imagine if you were building an application with, 3 or 4 other web developers, and they add a new feature to the application, and it requires you to add a new column to a table. Well, when you pull in their latest source code from Git and then try to run the application, it might crash, or it most definitely will crash until you manually go into your local database and add that new column that it's expecting. So in other words, what I'm getting at here is we don't want to have to micromanage table creation like this. It would be nice if Laravel could create all of our tables for us, and especially if it could create all of the different columns that we're going to need. In other words, instead of you and I ever needing to do anything manually to MySQL directly, it would be ideal if we could just define things in PHP files, in our Laravel source code, and then Laravel can manage all of that for us. So you and I don't need to leave the comfort of, living within the context of Laravel. Laravel can automate all of these different database actions for us. If that doesn't make sense yet, trust me, that's okay. I had to learn about database migrations at least 10 or 15 times before it really made sense to me. And I think by the end of this video, once you see it in action and you can practice and erase things and bring it back up again, I think by then it will be crystal clear. So, where do we get started? Well, if we want Laravel to manage our database for us, the first step is to give Laravel permission to connect to our database server. Now to do that, in our Laravel source code files, you'll see that there's a file named .env. Right now I want you to go ahead and open up the .env file, and we're interested in lines number 11 through 16. So this is where we can connect to our local database server. So we can leave these first 3 values just with their default values, but on line 14 for DB database, our database is not named Laravel. We named it our Laravel app. Okay? And then our username is root, but then our password is root, or whatever you chose for your password. So go ahead and save this file. Okay, and now let me show you your first example of how Laravel can manage our database tables for us. So remember earlier when I said that, you wouldn't want to have to go into tables in MySQL and manually, create a table and spell out all of the different columns that you'll need. You don't want to have to do this manually. So in the context of Laravel and having Laravel do this for us automatically, this is what we refer to as a migration. Now, Laravel actually has a few migrations by default before you and I even set any up. Let me show you what I mean. So in your source code, if you look in the database folder, and then you can look in the migrations folder, you'll see that Laravel comes with several files out of the box. So this first one, that the file name starts with 2014, 10, 12, but it ends with create users table. So you can imagine in any sort of application, a user account is one of the most basic concepts. So Laravel can sort of just assume that it would be a good idea if it could help us create a table called users. So if you double click on that file, we can take a look. Essentially, it's going to create a table with a column called ID, a column called name, email, a column called password, so on and so forth. Now, you might be thinking, hey, I go into Workbench and I refresh, I don't see a table called users. Well, that's because we haven't told Laravel to actually run that migration yet. So check this out. Do this with me. In your command line, so you can open up a new command line. If your PHP Artisan server is up and running, you can just click this plus symbol to open up a second command line. But type this in with me. PHP Artisan migrate. So what this is going to do is Laravel is going to run any and all of these migrations that it hasn't already ran. So just go ahead and press enter. Okay, you'll see a little bit of status updates. So it's just saying, green text that it was done successfully. But if I go back into SQL Workbench and click this little icon to refresh, notice now that under my tables, I have all sorts of different tables. I have failed jobs, migrations, password resets, personal access, pets, but also users. And if we click on this icon to look at the users table, while we don't have any user items or user records yet, we do have columns, right? So Laravel automatically created this table with these columns like ID, name, email, password. Now, what if you and I wanted to make some changes to this? So what if instead of this column being name, we wanted it to be username? And what if we wanted to add an entirely new column named avatar? Well, there are a few different ways. Let's start with the easiest. So back in VS Code, jump into that migration file that we were already looking at, right? The one that ends in create users table. So Laravel already set this file up for us. Just scroll down to about line number 18. So there's going to be a column, it's of the string type. Instead of name, we can just change this to username. And then let's add a new column named avatar, and it's allowed to be empty. So we'll just say on a new line, $table, dash greater than to look inside an object and call a method. It'll be a string, parentheses to call it. Let's give it string, so quotes, and we'll name it avatar. Right, that can store a URL that points towards a little picture for that user. At the end of that, let's say that it's allowed to be empty. So that's what this, if you call the method nullable on it. So dash greater than, we'll just call nullable, semicolon. Cool. Let's go ahead and save this file. And now what I want to show you right now is that if you just ran the command php artisan migrate again, nothing is going to happen. It's not going to magically update this table and the different columns and the new columns that we spelled out. So even if you refresh, see it's still name and there is no new column named avatar. That's because as far as Laravel is concerned, it has already ran this migration. Now don't worry, a bit later in this lesson I'll show you how to make an update to an existing table, but in situations like this when we're just starting out and we don't have any data that we're actually worried about losing, I want to show you a really cool option. So again, just to be clear, this command that I'm about to show you, don't ever run this command on a database where you have actual data that you don't want to lose. But if you're just starting fresh and there is no data to worry about losing, check this out. We can just say php artisan migrate :fresh. So here's what the :fresh is going to do. It's going to drop every single table in our database. And it will even drop the pets table that it didn't create. So it's just going to drop every single table in the database and then recreate them brand new, fresh, based on our migration files. So that will indeed include the changes we made, right? We named it username instead of name. We added this new avatar column. So just go ahead and press enter to run that command. That's going to automatically go and delete all the tables and then recreate them. So you would have lost data if you had actual data to lose. But now, if I click this icon to refresh the table list, notice that the pets table that I created manually at the very beginning of this lesson, it's completely gone now. But if we go into users, right, if I click on this icon for the users table, perfect. Instead of name, the column is username. Here we see that brand new avatar column. Awesome. So that command we just ran is really useful if you don't really have any data that you're worried about losing. However, what if you did, what if we had 10,000 user accounts, so rows in this table that we didn't want to lose? But what if we did want to modify the table? What if we wanted to add a brand new column called favorite color, but we didn't want to lose any of the actual data? So we couldn't just say, migrate fresh. We need a reliable way to add a new column to an existing table. So this is a perfect example of when you would create a new migration file. So for example, back in VS Code, in this migrations folder, we want a brand new file, and we can give it a name. Instead of create users table, it can be add favorite color column. So let me show you what we can do. Run this command with me. PHP artisan make migration, and then just give it a name. I'll name it add favorite color column. So I used underscores instead of spaces. But as soon as I press enter, notice there's a brand new file in our migrations folder, right? And it's named add favorite color column. So let's open up that brand new file. And if you scroll down a little bit, we're interested in line number 14, where there's this function called up. So when this migration runs, this is where we would want to add a column to that table. So after these two slashes, so right about here, let's say schema : table. So schema is a Laravel class. We don't have to create it. Up at the very top of this file, you can see the blueprint code is already importing it or using that namespace for us. So we get easy access to schema. And then double colon like this, that's how you use a static function that belongs to a class. So we're calling its table method. You can end that line with a semicolon. In these parentheses, first argument is the table that you're wanting to add to or modify. So that's the users column, the users table. And then for the second argument, we just give it a function. So function, parentheses, curly brackets. In these parentheses, let's make up a parameter name. Let's call it $table. Okay. Then in the body of the function, we'll say $table. Look inside that object with dash greater than, and let's just create a column that's of the data type of a string. And let's give it a name of favorite color. End that line with a semicolon. Cool. Now if we scroll down a little bit more, around line 27 or so, you'll see there's a function named down. So this is where you would just want to do the opposite. You're sort of cleaning up after yourself. So if someone performed this migration, but then they weren't happy with things and they wanted to roll back, right, you would just want to delete or remove that column. You're cleaning up after yourself. So we would just say schema : table, parentheses to call it, semicolon. We're working with the users table once again, comma, let's give it a function, parentheses, curly brackets for the parameter $table. In the body of our function, we would just say $table, look inside it and call the method drop column. And we named it, so quotes, favorite uppercase color, just like this. So do this with me. You can save this file, and now in the command line, if we run php artisan migrate, Laravel will keep track of things. It knows that it has not ran this new migration yet, so as soon as we press enter, it's going to run it. If I go into Workbench, and if I just refresh this view, or if you click on this icon next to the users table, awesome, there you see at the end, favorite color. And this is cool because even if we had 10,000 rows in this table, we would not have lost any data. We weren't starting fresh. We were just performing a simple migration that's only responsible for adding a new column to the table. Here's why this is so awesome. Imagine you were working with 2 or 3 other developers, and you're using Git, so GitHub or GitLab, and you pull in the newest changes that other developers on your team have created. So in other words, there's going to be new files in this migrations folder, and then you don't need to go into your local database and perform any sort of actions manually. Literally, you just run the command of php artisan migrate, and these simple PHP files in the migrations folder, they're going to take care of everything. This makes it really easy to keep in sync with other developers, and even if you needed to switch to a different development computer, like if you wanted to switch from your laptop to your desktop. And this also makes it really, really easy when it comes time to finally push our application up to the live production server. In other words, being able to automate database tasks like this is awesome. Now, to wrap things up in this video, I don't actually want a column called favorite color in my users table. That was just a quick example to show you how you could perform an action to an existing table without wiping out all of your data. Anyways, because I don't actually want this column, I'm just going to delete this migration file. I don't actually need it, so I'm just deleting that new file. Cool. And before we close out this lesson, let's make a couple of adjustments in our create users table migration file. So for example, on line 18 on the username column, I want to make sure that the username is unique. In other words, when we start letting users sign up for user accounts, I want MySQL to make sure that, hey, no one with that username already exists in the database. To do this in Laravel, it's super easy. This is awesome. You can just, on this line where we're defining the username column, right after this closing parentheses, we can chain on another method. So dash greater than, and just call the method that's called unique. Parentheses to call it. It's that easy. Cool. Let's go ahead and save this file. And now just to make sure we're all on the same page, let's run a fresh migration. Because we don't have any data, we don't have any rows or actual content in the table that we're worried about losing, right? So as soon as we run this fresh migration, we're no longer going to have favorite color, and then Laravel will start to make sure that the username values are unique. Or to put it another way, when we run this command, Laravel is going to delete every single one of our tables and then recreate them fresh. So to do that, remember, it's just php artisan migrate : fresh. If I run that command, if I go back into Workbench and I click this icon to view a fresh view copy of the users table, awesome. The favorite colors column is gone and we are in business. Now, if everything in this video didn't make perfect sense, that's okay. Don't worry. Throughout this course, you and I are going to create many different migrations together. So yes, Laravel already had this migration called create users table, but remember, we're going to be setting up blog posts and the ability for one user to follow another user. So don't worry, you and I are going to go over this concept of migration several more times. You and I will step by step create the migration for the blog post table, for the follows table, so on and so forth. Cool. Now at this point, let's talk about where we go next. So in our very next lesson, now that we have this users table in our database, we're going to start working on connecting the dots. In other words, when someone visits our homepage, right, there's this registration form. Well, the whole point of this form is to create a user account or a user record in our database, right, where we store their name, their email, their hashed password value, so on and so forth. This is where our application really comes to life, and this is where we really start to feel powerful as a web developer. So let's keep our momentum rolling, and I will see you in the next lesson.